So we're gonna start with Sarah Smith, who is the Building Peace Program Officer at the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. And prior to joining the foundation, she conducted research and supported policy advocacy at the Uppsala Department of Peace and Conflict Research and the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Then we will move on to Margaret Williams, who is the 16-plus Forum Coordinator and Senior Policy Officer at the World Federation of United Nations Associations, WFUNA. We'd say WFUNA, right? And one thing that is not in her bio that you'll read that I would like to note is that she is also a former colleague at the International Peace Institute, and much of IPI's work at the International Peace Institute on youth traces back to our work with the Independent Commission on Multilateralism, the ICM, and Margaret was instrumental in promoting that work at that time. So thank you, Margaret. And then we're going to move on to Anna Katarina, who I imagine is no stranger to many of you. She is the focal point on youth, peace, and security. Youth and security. We talked about this last night talking about the differences between New York and Vienna. In Vienna, it's youth and security. In New York, it's youth, peace, and security at the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. And she is also was previously the special envoy for the chairmanship in office, and so the predecessor to Samuel Goda, right? And much experience there. And then finally, we will hear from Gordana Berjan, Executive Director of the European Youth Center at the Council of Europe, which is a part of the Youth Department of the Council of Europe. And the center, interestingly, I really look forward to hearing about this, is a residential educational establishment set up for young people and youth organizations to be empowered through human rights education and to play an active role in building democratic societies. A lot to talk about, and we will start with Sarah. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Adam. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Foundation's work, the Foundation works in the name of Dag Hammarskjöld, who is the Second Secretary General of the United Nations, to influence policy on peace and development. And we often do this by trying to facilitate dialogue and exchange between different stakeholders for greater collaboration and cooperation. So it's a great opportunity for us to be here today to connect to some of the Vienna-based organizations. The Foundation has been involved for the past 3 or 4 years on follow-up initiatives to promote implementation of Resolution 2250, including being part of the steering committee for the progress study on youth, peace, and security. And we currently are part of the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace, and Security. And so I know that the resolution has been mentioned several times already. But I think there were quite a few people who did not raise their hands when asked if they'd read the resolution. So I thought I'd give just a brief overview of the resolution and then go into the progress study as well. So the resolution includes 5 pillars. And the first one is participation, the need for young people to be actively engaged in peace processes. And I think this is when we're talking about cooperation, and I'll get into this later on. I think the participation pillar is absolutely critical. The second pillar is protection, the importance of ensuring that young people who are experience violence or armed conflicts are protected. The third pillar is prevention and the role of young people in actually preventing violent extremism, violence, and conflict. The fourth pillar is partnerships, and obviously this is when talking about cooperation, I think this is obviously a very important pillar as well. The need for not only kind of the different UN agencies to work together across the UN system, but also for the UN to work with civil society, with young people on implementing this agenda. And then the fifth pillar is disengagement and reintegration, the importance of including those young people who have been involved in violence and not kind of seeing them only as violent actors, but seeing them as also agents of change. So I think that when talking about youth peace and security, I think the story behind youth peace and security is very much one of cooperation and collaboration, and most importantly, engaging young people in the process. 2250 was a result of civil society led by many young people and youth initiatives pushing for a resolution that would actually recognize their role in preventing and resolving conflicts. And the resolution, as has already been mentioned, also calls for a study to look at how young people are engaging in their communities and what barriers to engagement they face. And there are a few things that I want to highlight in relation to the progress study. And the first one is the process behind the study, and the study as an example of how we can actually better work with young people and cooperate across different UN agencies and across different stakeholders. So there were several different processes that went into the progress study. The first was focus group discussions with young people across the globe. And the Foundation, for example, conducted a focus group discussion with young people from more marginalized suburbs of Stockholm. And I think this is also a really important thing to highlight, is the universality of this agenda, that this is important not only in conflict or post-conflict environments, but also in countries like Sweden, which are generally considered fairly peaceful. In addition to the focus group discussions, there were also 7 regional consultations with young people to talk to them and listen to their experiences and perspectives on what they wanted to highlight in the study. And there was also a validation consultation at the end, which brought young people from each of the regional consultations to hear some of the preliminary findings from the progress study and allow them to also brainstorm on what they felt was important to raise in the study. And I think this is an example of how not only were there these initial regional consultations, but there was also an attempt to follow up with them and allow them to be part of the process more long term. And the third element behind the progress study was also building on the knowledge and expertise of civil society organizations who had been working on youth peace and security prior to the resolution, and really using the kind of that different stakeholders and seeing, building off of each other's work and seeing where different stakeholders could add value to the process. In terms of the main messages of the progress study, I think there are 3 things that I want to highlight here, and some of them have already been touched upon earlier this morning. The first message, I think, has to do with debunking the assumptions and stereotypes of youth as violent. And the study clearly says that in approaching youth, assuming that they are at risk of violent conflict or violent extremist, it actually further contributes to their stigmatization, and that rather we need to be better at approaching young people because they are actually agents of change, and that we see that they have a positive role to play in society. And I think this also goes to better understanding why young people join violent extremist groups. And there's a lot of research that I think the progress study points to, showing that young people, it's not just because they're unemployed. Young people feel disenchanted with the governments, and they feel that this is, for many young people, this is the only opportunity for them to actually feel like they have a voice and a role in society. The second message that I wanted to highlight today is that youth are diverse and that they are engaged in various ways. And I think this is, in many ways, maybe common knowledge, but something that I think needs to be highlighted in any case. Yes, young people have diverse opinions. They have diverse experiences. They have diverse perspectives. And I don't necessarily think that this is a bad thing. I think it's about finding a common ground for them to then create a space in which young people can promote their own participation and allow for these different perspectives to be highlighted. But I mean, young people are representative of the societies in which they live, so that it's not very strange that they are diverse, and that this diversity, I think, should actually be celebrated. And I think This diversity also means that young people are engaging in very different ways throughout all phases of conflict and peace, in different types of violence at every level, from the community level to the national level to the international level. I think also one thing that I wanted to highlight here is that because young people are diverse, I think we need to be really careful at looking at not just kind of grouping young people in one group and saying we need to engage young people, but actually looking at who are the young people that we're engaging, and recognizing that in a lot of processes, it is the young elite that are engaged, and we're not then actually reaching out to those young people who are more marginalized. And if we want to talk about sustaining peace and what is needed to actually have sustainable peace, we need to reach out to those young people who do not have a voice and who do not have a platform. It's not only about, I mean, a lot of people have mentioned already Greta Thunberg, and that's great. I think she has a really great message and is doing a lot of good work. But it is not only about supporting her platform, it's about finding ways to support those young people who don't have a platform. I think another thing that young people highlighted in the process behind the progress study is that they really saw this connection between peace processes and development, which has already been highlighted, but also human rights and other issues. So I think that just goes to the point of the need to make sure that this is implemented across the UN system. This is not something that only one UN agency should be taking forward. This is really something that the UN, together with civil society and young people, should be working on together. The third message from the progress study that I wanted to highlight was this idea of exclusion as a form of violence. Many young people who were involved in the progress study highlighted or spoke to this idea that in not being included and not being able to participate, it is actually a form of structural violence against young people, and that we need to look at beyond kind of the traditional sports, arts, education and employment programming, and really look at how we can include young people in conversations on sustaining peace, in conversations on development, etc. That young people want to be at the table in all issues, not just kind of the traditional youth issues. And at the same time, I think turning this around and making sure that when we do discuss youth participation, that it's seen as an important issue for decision makers to be there as well. So I think that kind of are the main messages from the progress study that I wanted to highlight, and I think when looking at cooperation are the key relevant ones. And I think just to sum up, I think the importance of seeing young people as partners across peace and development, and that they shouldn't be engaged from the beginning in the process design and as leaders. And that this involves regular dialogues with young people to understand their experiences and perspectives and what they want to see going forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that very, very helpful, succinct primer on 2250 and the progress study, looking at the pillars of participation, protection, prevention, partnership, and reintegration. It was
participation, protection, prevention, partnerships.
Partnership. Oh, and there are I thought there was a fifth, reintegration. That's something separate.
Disengagement and reintegration.
DDR, great. Really, really helpful. And looking at the progress study as an example, as a model of how to include is extremely important. And I thought I just took this minor point that you mentioned about that the progress study did a good job of building on knowledge that is already there. I think that those of us that work around the UN, there's this tremendous capacity for the UN to sort of think that they're to constantly reinvent the wheel. And it's really important to recognize that the youth engagement is not something new. It's been happening for a long time, and there's a lot to be learned from what's already been out there. And that youth are diverse, representative of the societies where they live. The issue of inequality came up in the last session as well, and I think this is also a really important point. about the need to include youth voices, but also to recognize that sometimes the youth voices that are included are not themselves representative of the larger society. So we need to reach out to include those marginal voices in this agenda. Much appreciated. We will now move on to Margaret Williams. Margaret, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I think we still have a couple more minutes of morning, so good morning. My name is Margaret Williams. I'm the Senior Policy Officer at the World Federation of United Nations Associations and the 16 Plus Forum Coordinator at WFUNA. I also have the privilege of having worked at IPI before, so this is a particularly wonderful opportunity for me to be here, so I thank the Austrian Foreign Ministry, Ministry of Defense, and IPI. I'd also like to thank Sarah and our fellow panelists already at the outset and those that have already spoken. Sarah, you did a great job of basically highlighting the pillars of 2250 and some of the key messages around the progress study. So to then start with what we know and what we've already mentioned briefly today. At 1.8 billion, young women and men present an incredible opportunity for peace and development, the famous demographic dividend. Other things we know. Societies that offer opportunities for youth participation in political and economic realms, as well as routes for social mobility, tend to be more peaceful. Enhancing the participation of women and youth in decision-making, as well as long-term policies to address their aspirations, are fundamental to sustaining peace. Prevention is more cost-effective than violence. And according to the Secretary General of the UN, the active engagement of young women and men can make a critical difference in averting violence and war. This should be recognized, supported, and promoted as a precondition for the success of efforts to build enduring peace. What we also know, certain assumptions seem to be incredibly hard to shake. Despite evidence going back for more than a decade contesting the relationship between youth unemployment, education, and violence, some continue to incorrectly assume a natural progression for unemployed or uneducated youth to participate in violent extremist groups. These kinds of assumptions can result in ineffective short-term policies and approaches, a policy panic that often alienates people and adds to mistrust. So, what is needed? Sustained efforts to not only permanently change the narrative around young people, but to also acknowledge and capture their work currently being done to promote security and inclusive peace, to mitigate violent extremism, to prevent crime, to oppose corruption, while pushing for policy programming and funding shifts that adequately support this work and the meaningful inclusion of young people in decision-making processes. There is momentum for this, which is good news, but there's also much, much more needed. Adam had asked that I share a couple examples of young people working on issues related to YPS or sustaining peace, as well as their overlap to other international agendas. So here are some examples for you. The Elman Peace and Human Rights Center in Somalia is an independent nonprofit focused on human rights, gender justice, the protection of civilians, preventing violent extremism, peace building, social entrepreneurship for peace, etc. It's co-led by a woman named Ilwad Elman, who is now only this year turning 30. It's an internationally recognized organization that addresses the needs of the most vulnerable in Somalia. Its Drop the Gun, Pick Up the Pen initiative aims at disarmament, rehabilitation, and reintegration of young women and men who've been co-opted in clan-based militias. Close to 3,700 individuals, so thousands, have participated in the center's program, and the center has also collaborated with the Ministry of Security in Somalia on a relatively newly launched action plan for CVE. In Malawi, Youth in Society, another NGO, has as its core mission to promote and defend human rights and democratic governance through capacity building, advocacy, public interest litigation, civic education, etc., with a focus on young people and marginalized groups. Its co-founder, Charles, who is now 32, regularly mobilizes and inspires Malawian citizens to participate in public policy and governance discourse. He is also a prominent anti-corruption campaigner currently providing leadership in confronting 6 high-profile corruption cases through the courts. We've already heard this morning about how important and pervasive the issue of corruption is to all the issues that we're working on. Dare to be Grey is an online peer-to-peer platform founded by a group of students from Utrecht University in the Netherlands, which aims to combat what it calls polarization, the type of binary thinking typically promoted by extremist groups in public debates, including in Europe. To complement what was said already about the work of young people in the Colombian peace process, young people have also contributed to highly localized issues and projects, including the transformation of an area called Comuna 13, which had previously been considered one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Medellin, Colombia, into now what is a vibrant community that welcomes tourists for graffiti tours, for example, and to take part in its cultural activities. So young people actually leading the change for a transformative shift at a local level, changing the space in which they operate, not just for themselves, but for everybody involved. So then the next question is, what can we do to further change the narrative around young people globally, and to further shift policy programming and, very importantly, funding to more justly and adequate support these young people who are not just fighting for their future, but also for our collective present. To pull from the progress study and various other studies that have been either mentioned so far or that feed into this work, a couple of key recommendations, some of which have already been mentioned. So to invest in young people's capacities, their agency, and their leadership. The leadership issue is very important. Young people are leaders. So to invest in their leadership, whether it's through university programs, other types of funding support, etc. To ensure that programs related to youth peace and security are designed, implemented, monitored, and evaluated with and by young people. So hand in hand with young people as partners, not as necessarily recipients, beneficiaries, or projects. And this also includes in the allocation of grants, again, the funding issue. To transform the systems that reinforce exclusion in order to address structural barriers that limit youth participation in peace and security. This includes political exclusion and issues around justice and human rights. To support innovation and encourage youth-inclusive governance processes and legislative frameworks, prioritize partnerships and collaborative action across the board, including with the private sector, to scale up youth-led projects to be supportive of gender-sensitive approaches, and to protect civic space and legitimate space for engagement. Support data, and finally, I would also mention to promote interlinked agendas. There are a couple, in kind of my final section of remarks, just a couple mechanisms that already exist to do these things on a more systematic basis that I thought I would very quickly mention. Those are the implementation of national action plans for 2250 or the implementation of national action plans for the prevention of violent extremism. Finland and Jordan, for example, done national action plans on 2250. To focus on the systemization of youth empowerment and inclusion through national development plans or countries' national strategies. This is already being done by countries in the global north and in the global south. To leverage overlap with other UN frameworks, such as with the SDGs, and specifically SDG 16, as well as SDG 5, and many others. I work on SDG 16 specifically to advance peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, which has targets specifically focused on anti-corruption, violence reduction, and responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making. In this same vein, to support greater policy coherence across international and frameworks, to actually drive implementation, operationalization, and meaningful change on the ground. To use high-level events such as the VNR process. This year, at the Voluntary National Review, Goal 16 will be reviewed for the first time. It presents an opportunity to highlight interlinkages between overlapping agendas and the role of youth in driving the SDGs and in driving youth peace and security. And also to get to the consultation, to come back to this consultation issue that you mentioned, Timor-Leste, for example, is reporting for the first time ever at the VNR process at the high-level political forum in July. Timor-Leste was already mentioned as one of the most youthful countries in the world. in the consultations that they did for their voluntary national review, they had 2 specifically geared towards young people. And young people provide a foundation to their VNR, which I think is actually a very good example of trying to put youth people within national policies and political frameworks. And, finally, I would just also mention the importance of regional organizations and supporting regional organizations to adopt youth peace and security and prevention into policy and program as related to their member states. So I tried to time myself. My phone didn't work, so I'm sure I'm over time. So what I will just conclude with is that young women and men from the local to the global are already working on prevention and sustaining peace. So it's actually more on us, as large as the international community and the multilateral system, to better partner with them. We have the evidence. We have many of the tools. What we really need is political will. We need leadership, policy coherence, coordination, and investment to support this extraordinary democratic dividend as a human rights imperative and to bring about the change that we all want to see in this lifetime and the next. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Margaret. I just reiterate that last point that you made, that we have the evidence, that, as you said at the start, that societies that include youth tend to be more peaceful. And I think actually that also goes for so many processes of inclusion, that inclusion is such a fundamental part of sustaining peace. And you gave us some really good concrete examples of youth engaged in this work. And I just want to highlight your point about Comuna 13 in Medellin. I was actually there in August. This neighborhood in Medellin, which was at the core of the urban warfare in Colombia in the early 2000s, and the transformation is extraordinary. And you're absolutely right; it's was completely led by youth, and it's an extraordinary example, I think, of here is a context in which there was a formal process happening, but the youth weren't waiting to be included in the formal process. There were good processes of inclusion in that process, but they weren't waiting for an invitation. They had their own engagement, their own ways of recreating their community, and it's incredible to see. And I went on one of those graffiti tours, and the graffitis is amazing. Yeah, so great example. And thank you for the recommendations, in particular this point that you made a couple times actually about the need to promote interlinking agendas. I feel that already in the conversation today, that point is clear. Issues related to gender equality, issues related to inequality, sustainable development, the universality of the JUST agenda all come together, and it's really important that we see this in a holistic way. So thank you for all those recommendations. Very good. Now we are on. Speaking of, you also mentioned the importance of regional organizations, and that's actually a good segue to our next 2 contributors. And so we'll hear now from Anna Katarina Denninger from the OSCE. Anna, please.
Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you so much, Sarah and Maggie, for giving that overview. I'm very delighted to be here with all of you today, in particular the young audience who's ready to engage. And well, I'd like to focus, after we heard already a lot from Samuel and my colleague Philippe, what we as an organization are doing. I would like to focus concretely on cooperation. So on the first hand, how we do it internally, how we cooperate with other stakeholders, with other international and regional organizations, and then thirdly, and most importantly, how we partner up with young people. Because young women and men are really the connective tissue that bridge the silos, break the silos between our work, may it be in security cooperation, human rights, corruption, sustaining peace. So I really take that point that the global youth peace and security agenda has to be also promoted on the regional level. And Adam, as you made that connection beforehand to what we call the youth and security agenda, as Philippe said, we at the OSCE follow this comprehensive approach where we see that political, military, economic, environmental, and human rights approaches are really so strongly interlinked and interrelated that we cannot achieve security nor peace without them. So basically, we have the peace strongly on the agenda being bridged in that concept. It's also let's say on a personal level, delightful to be here with you on the panel and with you in the room, because beforehand Martin and Monica talked about AFA, the United Nations Youth Association. That was basically my first entrance point into the world of international affairs. Then I once took part in a seminar organized by Wifuna in Geneva on how young people can actually be trained to help promoting human rights. Then at a later stage, I worked preparing to the regional consultations leading to the progress study, and also in particular in 2017 when Austria had the chairmanship over the OSCE, which this year is held by Slovakia. There was also a strong focus on youth, and I had the pleasure to be special representative for Austria back then, and it's very great to see how this focus on this important issue is being kept and promoted in different areas. So we heard before that on the political level in the OSCE, youth is gaining traction. We had already the first references to the importance of youth in the Helsinki Final Act in '75, which is our founding document. And ever since we had a look at our archives, we came across approximately 100 pages of where our ministers of foreign affairs and heads of states and other decision-making bodies refer to the role of young people, young professionals, as well as on the role of education to promote comprehensive security. And then, last but not least, in Milan last year, our foreign ministers acknowledged the role of young people to contribute to a culture of peace, dialogue, justice, peaceful coexistence, trust, as well as reconciliation. And in order to help our participating states, which span from Vancouver to Vladivostok, 57 of them, in order to help them to better make use of those commitments and to better implement them, we at the Secretariat, and I have to also underline that our Secretary General, Thomas Greminger, is a strong supporter, champion of the youth agenda. We had a look at how we can best do that. What is the OSCE's role? What can we best do? How to not interfere with the work that's maybe happening in New York, not interfering with the important work that's happening on the ground. And so we came up with what we call a framework for strengthening OSCE efforts in youth and security. It's an informal, in-house document with some actionable recommendations on how to better do our work. So in this regard, we had a look what's happening already. Most of all, in our field operations, we have a lot of them in the Western Balkans, in Central Asia, as well as Eastern Europe, and in our institutions. You may have heard of ODIHR, the Office for Human Rights and Democratic Institutions, the High Commissioner for National Minorities, as well as the Representative for the Freedom of the Media. And also we had a look what other international organizations, what civil society is doing, and we identified 4 pillars where the OSCE can have an added value when we engage with youth and for youth. So first of all, this is about amplifying young voices to promote a more secure future. It is about promoting people-to-people contacts, bringing young individuals together from across the OSCE region to promote mutual understanding and to learn from each other. Thirdly, we would like to promote the inclusion of young people through addressing key social and environmental challenges. And last but not least, we would like to support the role of young people as catalysts for peace and security efforts. And how to do that? We also came up with some recommendations. Again, this is very different, I think, when you have a look at how the UN functions, how the OSCE functions. We have a very complex network of different mandates, so it's very different to say you have to do that, but we want to inspire and how's that called? Insensitize? Motivate our colleagues to do that. So we would like, first and foremost, to create more opportunities for integrating youth perspectives into our work. That can be through inviting young people to our regular conferences. Sometimes you may hear that the OSCE does not stand for Security and Cooperation in Europe, but for sipping coffee in Europe or for seminars. This, of course, is a notion I strongly reject. But of course, we do promote the implementation of our commitments in the field. We help our host countries. We do a lot of work. But what's visible here in Vienna is mainly the conferences that are taking place. So we would like to have young people seated on the table, not just as a topic on the table. We would like to, and this points towards the question that you raised before, we would like to promote youth-sensitive human resource policies. So our colleagues in human resources just recently had a revamp of the junior professional officers program. We now have a closer look on how to make internships more fair and more, more equal in terms of that young people do not necessarily have to go through this vicious circle of unpaid internships. And also we would like, of course, to see a recognition of the values and the experience gained in volunteering and in different things. We would like, as also Maggie has mentioned, to not just see young people as beneficiaries in our work, but also to have them as partners in our programmatic work from all phases of the project management cycle, to take their needs, their concerns, and their opinions into consideration in the different phases. We'd also like to build internal capacity, letting our colleagues, not just the older ones, also the newly arriving ones, know what this agenda is about, and we'd like to better coordinate internally. That brings me to the next point. How do we work on the youth portfolio within the OSCE? So Philippe has already mentioned the group of friends on youth and security, which is chaired by Spain, undoubtedly one of our leading champions on the youth agenda. And this basically is a platform for our participating states to informally discuss what's happening in the agenda and to discuss best practices, current developments. And in the very, very first edition of this event, we actually had a colleague of Guadana from the Council of Europe sharing what we usually refer to as the gold standard in youth participation, how you do it. Also, in one of the last meetings, we had Graham Simpson, as you mentioned, discussing with us how youth peace and security can be implemented on a regional level. Then when it comes to the working level, we have a broad network, what Samuel mentioned, the youth focal points. So in our field operations, in our institutions, we have colleagues which do a lot of different work, but also covering the youth portfolio. So we would like to bring those different examples, different best practices closer together to exchange and to learn from each other. And in this regard, we also have a close look at the gender focal points network, because, I think that the gender and the youth agenda have a very different set of rules, normative guidelines, structures. One of the key similarities of the two of them is actually by enhancing inclusivity of our processes, to make our work a better and a more sustainable one, and to deliver the results that are needed on the ground and that are needed by societies. And in this regard, I'm also very, very happy that our chairmanship in office, Samuel and his team, are about to organize one of the first meetings for all youth focal points to better work together and to learn more about youth peace and security. That also brings me to how we work with other international organizations and other stakeholders in the field. So as a Chapter 8 organization, we usually refer to ourselves as the largest security organization in the world. We, of course, have a close look what's happening at the UN, and we try to not duplicate the work, but picking our things in. And our aim is also to prevent conflicts from breaking out that they actually have to be dealt with at the UN Security Council. So we try to keep everything, peacefully, orderly, not always successfully, but we're trying our best, and we can never say what would be happening if we wouldn't be doing that work. So on the one side, the progress study really was a long-awaited milestone in order to hear those messages that we already sense throughout the room, around our work, to use it as a tool on the one side for the data, for the evidence, but also for the messaging and for convincing the wider audience. What's maybe interesting to some of you representing states, or also from different sides, I think that sometimes the position of states, maybe UN member states, OEC participating states, sometimes it's not exactly 100% congruent. It's very much also in line with people. We have some fascinating leaders on the political level who support the agenda, and I think there needs to be more coherence also in how this agenda is being seen on the different levels. Then also the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security. How many of you know the Global Coalition? I see some hands, wonderful. So that is basically a joint network by the UN and also driven by civil society organizations to better exchange information. And recently, in springtime, there was the first meeting open to regional organizations. So it was extremely exciting and thrilling and interesting to hear how, for example, the African Union or the Commonwealth are dealing and getting prepared to actually work on and deliver on the youth peace and security agenda. And I think that such ways to actually engage should be strengthened, and there is certainly a need for better coordination in that regard. And then last but not least, of course, it's events like this one today, where you do not only bridge the gap between the UN seats on one side and the other of the Atlantic, but also between what's happening on the one side of the Danube and on the other side. Because of course we are in regular contact on the working level, we do have high-level exchanges, but there is certainly a need to discuss this issue as such. And yeah, it serves as a reality check actually, as well as this event that Monica referred to, the first global symposium on youth participation in peace processes in Helsinki. Also, when it comes to programmatic work, there are a lot of things where we work together with our partners and our colleagues. So, for instance, just recently, I think last week or the week before, UNODC and our missions in the Western Balkans started working together on a training of sport trainers to actually prevent violence, prevent corruption, and prevent drug abuse and many other issues by getting young people together through the means of sports. Then on a different note, we have a very, very nice example of cooperation between our Forum for Security Cooperation section and the UNODA, if I'm not wrong, the Disarmament Affairs Office of the UN, with the Scholarship for Peace. That is a scholarship for approximately 100 people across the globe, and then in particular 50 young women who come to Vienna for 1 week to, besides an online learning platform, to also engage on the topics of non-proliferation, disarmament, and so on. And this also inspires more young women to actually have a leading role in this portfolio. And that brings me to the third point of cooperation. We do not only work for youth, but we also work with youth. We want to have young people on the table, and we want to bring in to all different events, for example, to the Ministerial Council meetings each year, and to many other events. We want to bring in a fresh young perspective. But of course we are aware that those people whom we give the chance to, or who take this chance to come and talk to us, those are just a very small fragment of the global youth population, because of course a room cannot cover, well, those huge numbers of young people everywhere. So we also try to focus not only on individuals, young leaders, but we also take it seriously to work with youth organizations and youth-led organizations, which actually have a multiplier effect. So when young people are sitting in the room, they're not just speaking on their behalf, but they have something standing behind them, and then they also have this way of sharing with their communities. So, for instance, what was referred to already 2 times was the Perspectives 2030 initiative. So this is one of our ways where we learn from activities in the past. We want to have a broader discussion. We want to bring in young experts who have the ownership to develop jointly how they see security cooperation, the threats, the challenges, but also the opportunities and solutions for how we can make security cooperation work again or work better towards the year 2030. And it's been really inspiring to see how within just 2 days this group was formed. They built the trust. They discussed topics without any barriers, without any what is that word? Prejudgments? Preconceptions, thank you. And to actually make that happen. But also for instance, because I referred to the Austrian chairmanship in 2017, 17, there was also a strong focus on engaging with young people to actually prevent and counter violent extremism and radicalization that may lead to terrorism at some point. So we gathered a group of young people in all different areas of the OSCE, so in the Western Balkans, in Central Asia, in the Black Sea region, for Eastern Europe, as well as for our Mediterranean partners for cooperation, where young people who are active in civil society, as practitioners and so on, where they came together in a safe space to discuss jointly which recommendations do they have for the policymakers, and then we invited them to forward those messages to the actual decision takers. So those are some ways how we try to inform the policy debate, but we also have many different ways of bringing young people together for different purposes. So we have networks for young water professionals in Central Asia. We have the Central Asian Youth Network, which brings together young people from Central Asia, plus Mongolia, plus Afghanistan, to discuss security perceptions in their region. One example very dear to my heart is also happening in Ukraine, supported by our project coordinator. It's called the Youth Contact Group. So there we have a group of young people from across the country with different backgrounds who get together on a frequent basis and who quite independently organize small-scale projects. They are supported by our mission, but they have the free hand to do what they deem best. So they organize discussion rounds, small workshops. Sometimes they also travel to discuss what they are doing. And then also one last point as a best practice example, which we also highlight in the framework and which we try to promote as much as possible, is the youth advisory groups. So this is something that I heard from different colleagues in the UN environment is also being considered, and I think that this is one of the areas where we can offer our experience in actually engaging young people in our programmatic work. So the example of youth advisory groups started, I think, in 2014 when Switzerland, as the chairmanship for the first time, set a strong priority on the political level. And then the colleagues in our mission to Bosnia and Herzegovina, they brought together a group of young people, again, from different ethnicities, from the different areas of Bosnia, getting together with our colleagues who do programming and project work. And they said, well, it's cool that you want to do something for youth, for example, on the topic of corruption, but bear in mind there is this one NGO in this local community, so get them on board. Or, for instance, if you want to reach out to our generation, maybe Twitter is not the way to go, try it through this way, that way. So it's really this low threshold way of, on the one side, also acquainting our own colleagues, our own system, to how to better work with young people. And that also inspires then a lot of change within the organization. And recently, so this youth advisory group in Bosnia, it grew. It now has, already, I think, the third generation of alumni. They also stay engaged. And also this now was spinned off to our presence in Albania. And in that regard, it's maybe interesting for some of you to know that Albania will take over the chairmanship of our organization next year. So I think they are well equipped to work with young people and not only for young people. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that all those topics that we discuss, prevention, sustaining peace, fighting corruption, promoting human rights, those are all areas that as organization, as the OSCE, we already have in our DNA. And by working with young people, we can actually strengthen our ability to promote peace, stability, and to promote cooperative security much, much better than we do when we stay in our silos. So I'm very happy to discuss and hear further from you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the very comprehensive delineation of much of the OSCE work on this and how you cooperate with other organizations and how it's actually been a part of the OSCE since the Helsinki Final Act. A lot of this seems to be around these four pillars, particularly the amplifying young voices and promoting people-to-people contact, creating more opportunities for inclusion. And I was listening to you, and part of me thought, well, if youth are not being included, it seems not to be for a lack of effort. there's so much energy behind this, and so maybe one point that I would put on the table for the discussion is given all this activity, you know, what are the obstacles? Why is it that youth still feel not included, excluded, and how can we improve that further? Because I think there are still challenges, and maybe a lot of this has to do with the issues related to inequality, that who's being included does not represent the entire society, which is always a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge in every aspect of international work. But now we'll hear from the Council of Europe. Please.
Thank you, Adam.
Ferdinand, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. How are you doing? Are you okay? There is not so much oxygen from time to time. There is some, but are you still okay? Do you want to stand up for a second? It's fine? Okay, then I go on. I'll try to be short, so we have also some time for questions. So my name is Gordana Berjan. I work for the Council of Europe in the youth department, so we promote youth participation very actively in the Council of Europe. I just want to say that the Council of Europe is one of the oldest European institutions, and it should not be mixed up with the European Council. We are an organization that works for human rights, the rule of law, and promotion of democracy. And we cover most countries in Europe, so we are a regional organization, as you heard. So we are working with most countries in Europe, from Ireland to Azerbaijan and Turkey, and up to Iceland and down to Turkey again, Italy, and so on. We also work with our neighboring regions, but primarily we are focusing on our 47 member states of the Council of Europe to promote human rights. Before I start, I will highlight 2 or 3 examples of how we work, and I think that mirrors very much what you have been saying, the principles of how we can have genuine and meaningful participation of young people. So I will just exemplify a few practices we have that I believe are worthwhile reflecting on, because we see that there are good results coming from this. We do many more things, but I cannot tell you everything. If you're interested, we can also talk about that later, but I will mention a few. But before starting, I want to extend my warmest thanks also to the Austrian authorities for inviting the Council of Europe, and also to the International Peace Institute for including us in this discussion. It's very kind of you, and we are happy to be here. So the Council of Europe, as I said, has a long history of promoting meaningful participation of young people in general, but also in decision-making processes, and trying to provide opportunities for youth to contribute to building more inclusive and democratic society. This is one of our terminology we use in Europe, within the Council of Europe, is how do we build inclusive societies where young people can take part in building that and also be active citizens in that. And one way of making sure that these young people can take part, and we have also been mentioning the elite, but also those that don't necessarily always participate. And I think it's very important that we think of both when we are discussing these issues, because often we, at this level, we engage with these very active young people also. So how do we make sure that we include also the other ones? And that's not always so easy, but we keep trying. And a way of ensuring that the young people can actually truly participate is that a decision was taken very early in the times of Council of Europe, in the early 70s, to set up a European Youth Centre, exactly for the reason of creating this safe space for young people to meet and to learn and discuss and live together under one roof. And this was already in the early 70s because it came from these student riots in the 60s, and it was a problem that the young people were doing these student riots. So then our Parliamentary Assembly decided we need a special space where young people can take part in building a common Europe and a common vision of Europe. And then later in 1995, the Council of Europe decided to open another centre in Budapest as a direct result of the fall of the Berlin Wall, communism, and that we had new emerging states in Central and Eastern Europe. And it was not to focus only on them, but to create more space for young people, because we wanted to reach out in this democratization process, also to reach out to these young people. So I work in this Budapest Center. And from the start, when our organization decided to work with young people, the principal decision was young people are a resource. Young people are a benefit to our organization, and their organizations are important to us, the civil society movements. We encounter from time to time also in our organization that young people are seen as a problem from other sectors, and we have successfully defended this approach and this principle. But of course, in these times of security discussions, this comes up also in our organization. But we are defending it very strongly, and I think by creating these residential training centers, we have also invested a lot in making sure that this safe space exists for the organization, and it's actually quite unique in that sense. As I said, this is a space where they can live and learn together about human rights. They can develop their skills. They can come up with new ideas for shaping the future of the communities. And we also spoke about spaces are created, but young people are not taking them. And I think we also have to think about who defines this agenda, who defines this space. And what is, I think, successful in the context of these two European youth centers, and I will tell you about this golden standard of participation, is that the young people and their peers are defining the agenda themselves, what will happen in those spaces. And they are working with each other, and we support them in that. But we want them to take the lead, and we provide them with the opportunities. This is our role, and this is the role of the member states that are part of the Council of Europe to provide this. Just to mention that we also work actively with promoting young people's access to human rights, besides this youth participation component that is very important to us. And another priority, and this is where I will focus on, is how do we engage young people in dialogue and in building inclusive and peaceful societies? This is one of the priorities of our youth sector. It's also a priority for the overall organization of the Council of Europe to see how we can build these inclusive societies, peaceful societies. So I'll give you 2 or 3 examples of how we do that. And Adam sent some questions beforehand that we should think of before we came, and I will take this example on how young people can play a positive role in promoting peace in their community. And one of the things we have done for many years now is setting up on an annual basis, we have something called the Youth Peace Camp. And it's one of our most visible and important activities. And a lot of resources go into this work. And though it's not many young people we reach out to, it's still very important that we make this space for them to have this youth camp. It brings together young people from different conflicting areas in Europe to engage in dialogue. This is one of also our principles of work. On the understanding that they share common values and that they share common experiences. Often they are very painful also, so we have to be ready for that. Needless to say, these young people and youth leaders, they're very brave to come to such events because it helps them to recognize and address issues of prejudice, to combat hate speech. This is something that we focus a lot on in the Council of Europe. And aggressive nationalism, extremism, and so on. And for some of these young people that we bring together, is the first time in their lives that they have to talk face-to-face with young people from the other side. And important to say with this Youth Peace Camp is that it's based in a human rights framework and grounded in the European Convention on Human Rights and the Universal Declaration, of course. And we base our work very much on human rights education. This is the core, this is the sort of fundament for all our work when we are working with young people and promoting intercultural dialogue. Maybe also to say that when we are working with this Youth Peace Camp and when we are looking at how young people can contribute to peace building, we are talking about this broader concept of peace, which includes the presence of democracy, justice and equality, and respect for each other's human rights. So we are not only talking about the lack of violent conflicts, but the sort of broader positive peace. And in all our activities that we do in this field, we are trying to convey that peace is an essential element for the realization of human rights, and at the same time, it is a product of human rights. We have been doing this camp for 16 years now, and we have done it with different conflicting regions. Over the year, this has changed. And actually, we have sometimes not had a conflict region part of it because it has been too difficult, and we have not found the right tools, and then we have looked for them, and then we have brought the groups back. So it depends a little bit on how the landscape looks in Europe, who we invite. But more and more importantly, and I think that is something we should maybe think of here also today, is that after the camp itself is very, has a lot of effects for the individual, of course, and it has a lot of effects for the communities. It has a lot of effects also for the Council of Europe, because we know more what we need to do when we have this dialogue with young people. But the idea is that these young people, and you are also working like that, they are multipliers, and they should go back in their communities, and they should go back and work on joint projects together in different ways. And the follow-up has become increasingly important. How do we make sure there is a sustainability in what we are doing? So how can we support the young people to come to these youth peace camps who are empowered very much? They come a few from each community, and then they go back to that reality again. And how can we help them to make sure that they can implement what they would like to? And in a way, we are trying to do that through our youth programs that we have, and we have a European Youth Foundation also that supports youth initiatives. So we try to channel some of our resources back into that. But it's not sufficient, and we would like to partner on these issues and how to support these who go through this process. We do also some other things in terms of peace building and young people. We have something called the Euro-Arab Dialogue and a youth forum, so we work with the Southern Mediterranean, our neighboring regions. And I just want to mention the No Hate Speech campaign. Maybe some of you have heard or seen it. It's a heart where it says, a red heart where it says no hate. It's actually a movement that came from the young people themselves. They wanted to address hate speech online and human rights online, and it started as a youth campaign in the youth sector of the Council of Europe, and then it grew into a Council of Europe campaign, and now we have set up mechanisms in most of our member states where this no hate speech, the results of the no hate speech campaign are actually continuing. So if you are interested in how you can counter hate speech, how you can create alternative narratives, we have a lot of educational materials, and we have a lot of experiences from this campaign. And this is also a tool that we use in peace building. The second example that Anna-Katarina mentioned is that I want to tell you about is how can we promote inclusion of young voices in international policy making around sustainable peace and other issues which are interesting for young people. And one of the quite unique things, I think, for an international organization which is intergovernmental is the fact that the Council of Europe is practicing a principle of co-management. And it means that we are sharing the decision-making equally between government officials, government representatives, and representatives of youth organizations. And that we have done for a very long time. So in everything that we do as an institution, intergovernmental institution, the young people take part. Here, for many years, we spoke about the elite that took part, but we have also changed our system in the representation of young people in this co-management principle and system, where young people who are not necessarily part of these traditional youth organizations can also be members of the Advisory Council on Youth, which this body is called. It's 30 youth representatives who are sitting together with 47 representatives of governments, taking decisions. Oops. Even got scared. Okay, so the youth representatives are sitting together with the government representatives, and they are actually taking decisions on what the priorities should be of the youth sector of the Council of Europe. They take decisions on the budget, and they take decisions on our activities and programs that we should implement in the 2 European youth centers. Which organizations should be granted awards for doing different study session, training courses, which subjects should be more prioritized than others. And not only that, and this is in a way a very strong acknowledgement of the role of young people and the civil society, the youth civil society, in making sure that they have a part in what we are doing. They also have this NGO committee. They also have an important, they don't only govern our work in the youth sector, but they are also asked to have an opinion on what the other sectors of the Council of Europe are doing, and particularly on issues which are of concern to young people. And of course, this is highly appreciated sometimes, and sometimes it creates a lot of conflicts and a lot of turbulence. There have been occasions where we have diplomatic incidences where the young people have issued an opinion, or this committee have issued an opinion. I can take one example of LGBTI, and it created a lot of, it was a Pride festival, and it created a lot of turbulence where we had to, and that was interesting to see also how governments react to that. It's true participation, and sometimes it works very well, it's very smooth, and sometimes it's quite complicated. So it doesn't mean, we also have to remember that this meaningful participation sometimes is also difficult. It's not like, oh, everyone is happy because everyone can take part. It is complicated, not only for the governments, but also for the young people who are represented in this committee to understand the mechanisms of decision making and how far can we reach in compromises. I come to an end. I just want to stress also that the composition of this advisory council is also very diverse. We talk about the importance of diversity, and that is also consciously because we want to make sure that we have different competencies and different representation and knowledge in this committee. And what we have always had, I think, I haven't gone too far back, is that we have had organizations which are working on peace issues, peace and security issues. And we have, for example, in this current mandate of 2 years, we have several representatives from the United Network of Young Peace Builders who are from different member organizations, and they make sure that we are having the peace building issues on our agenda and the promotion of the resolution 2250. My last point in that respect of this very good network, and it was mentioned also in the previous, I think you mentioned it in a previous session, is by providing these spaces like we do, and we capacity build the young people, what has happened in the Council of Europe to a large extent is that bringing these different groups of young people and supporting them, we have been part of an initiatives of setting up new networks and new platforms. And this is one of the, I think, good results, and that we are quite proud of in the Council of Europe, where we have new movements, we have alternative platforms to the existing one. And is one of those, for example, that we have worked very closely with. We have something called the United Network of the Voices of Young Refugees in Europe. They are also a product of this space that we provide in the Council of Europe, where they can act and they can make their voices heard. We have something also called the Youth Peace Ambassadors Network, and they are also promoting the resolution and the work that we are doing in this field. So I think this is also ways of empowering young people to create these platforms, to work with them, and to include their voices in international policy making. And I think it was mentioned before, this is especially important because these young people who we bring into these networks and movements, they are not necessarily represented in the traditional youth organizations and youth movements that we have. So it's extremely important to have this complementarity between the different, let's say, groupings of how young people organize themselves. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I realize I've been very free in my time management, and we only have about 15 minutes or so before lunch, but I think it's important to get all these concrete examples because there is a lot of tremendous work being done, and I think a lot of it revolves around this question of how do you create meaningful participation, meaningful inclusion, because it's not just about bringing people into a room, it's about making it meaningful, and you raise the question of the need to ask who defines the agenda. It's not meaningful participation is not just bringing young people to talk about what we want them to talk about, it's trying to get them to us to understand how they see the issues. So we'll go into Q&A. I can take a few questions if there are a few questions. And just to note, if disappointed about the short nature of this Q&A, the next session after lunch, I really encourage you to stick around after lunch because session 3 is framed to be interactive, and we're going to be looking for as much participation from the audience as possible during that session. Questions, comments, outrages. Yes, please, in the back.
Hi, I'm Daniela Pissoa from the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. I have a question for Ms. Cordana Berjan. I thought what you said about involving young people who are not the elite, I think is really, really important. And I was wondering, how do you do it? How do you do it practically? How do you reach out to these young people who are not the elite? Thanks.
Take another question before we come back, if anybody. Another question? Thought? Yes, Monica, please.
My name is Monica Fröhler, I'm the CEO of the Ban Ki-moon Center. A question to actually all of you. Now, probably with your speeches you have inspired a couple of the young audience members, but even beyond that probably, to engage in your various fields. I would like to know, what are the segues? What would you suggest to them? What's your recommendation how to enter the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, OSCE, or be it the case, the work of the Council of Europe, or your respective work in New York? Are there internships? Where can they turn to? How can they apply? How can they become change makers?
Great. One more, anyone else? Yes, please, over here. Oh, one more over here? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm from Women in International Security Austria, and I would actually like to take up the question you had, or the sentence you put onto the table. So we have all of these great initiatives, and what is lacking in order to get to succeed or to build inclusive societies?
Great. Who would like to start? Engaging with the non-elite, entryways into your organizations, and what are the obstacles? 3 big questions. Yeah, over it.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. To stay brief and to discuss more with you in detail in the session afterwards. Well, obstacles. Well, I think that we don't do very bad. We can always do much, much better. When it comes to the obstacles, I think the elephant in the room is, on the one side, funding, on the other side, political will. There is, of course, a strong political push by our chairmanship countries. There are many, many others supporting it, but we need more champions in this regard. Also, then, of course, is the internal know-how, how to do it, because it's quite a fresh agenda for us and how to best do it. So it's always great to hear from everybody in the room how you do it and to learn from each other. Not elites, again here, we can't invite the whole world into Hofburg, but we can build those bridges and build those corridors to actually engage different people and people who have a, well, some kind of network behind them. And this is also, I mean, what's one area that's not working directly with youth, but maybe more it is working for youth. For example, in our missions in Skopje and in Serbia, our colleagues help to assist the host countries in setting up their laws on youth participation, in particular on the local level, because change usually happens at the local level, and this is the best pathway to get in. Then when it comes to direct engagement with the organization, basically also for feeling how does it work from inside, internships, JPO programs, there are different pathways. I would recommend you, to those of you who are interested, approach me afterwards, or simply check out OSCE.org, and also promotion for Samuel's web presence, either on Facebook or on Twitter. I think we just discussed maybe we go on Instagram too. At OECE Youth SR would be a direct link to Samuel. If you check out the webpage, it's oece.org/youth, where you find most of all when we have opportunities that are open to the presence, because unfortunately we are not a donor organization that could give also small grants to local youth NGOs, but there are different ways to engage. And yep, that's it. Thanks so much, and I'm discussing gladly with you afterwards.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, I think I agree with Anna-Katarina that, I mean, part of it is when reaching out to those who are not elite, is using the networks that we have to make sure that they can then reach out and using them as, or making sure that they can be multipliers and that they feel like that they have the capacity to then go out into their communities and reach out to other young people. But I also think that it requires more kind of initiative on the part of international organizations to actually go to youth spaces rather than inviting youth to our own spaces and actually talking to them and recognizing that not all young people want to be engaged in formal processes. And some of them are engaged at the community level and that they are contributing to peace processes, but they don't necessarily want to engage in these kind of formal programs and aren't necessarily part of youth organizations or are youth kind of representatives of various organizations. I think in terms of building on the initiatives that we have, I think one of the things that the progress study calls for is YPS coalitions, where different organizations from the UN, from civil society, youth organizations, and youth representatives are working together in a coalition to share experiences and to build off of each other's work to make sure that there's not too much repetition and that we're actually kind of contributing to each other's work. And these coalitions are called for at both the global level, and Anna-Katarina mentioned the global coalition, which the foundation is a part of, but also the regional, national levels as well. So to find ways to really identify what other organizations are doing and to build off of each other's work. In terms of, for the foundation in particular, we're quite a small organization, so we unfortunately do not have a larger kind of internship program, but I'd be happy to talk to you during the lunch or coffee break more about the foundation.
Great, thanks. Any final thoughts, Margaret?
Just a couple final thoughts. Getting to the question that you mentioned that was then echoed. So the progress study actually notes 6 different forms of exclusion. Political, economic, justice, human rights, gender related, and 2 others that I can't remember right now. So I think when we're wondering, we're doing a lot to try to engage more young people, I think we should really be thinking about the different ways by which they are, young people across the globe are excluded. And I like your point about not just saying, hey, come to us, but we'll go to you. I think is a really important point to make. Also, heavy-handed security sector actors and outfits is one of the leading causes or strongly correlated to an uptick in violent extremism. So when you have heavy-handed police, when you have heavy-handed military, when young people, when you have these exclusionary processes, they're not very helpful. On what to do, so UNIWOI, which is mentioned a couple times, actually has done a pretty extensive mapping exercise of youth-led peace-building and peace-oriented organizations. I just go to their website, UNIWOI, United Network of Young Peace Builders, and they actually have mapped it out, and they continue to try to map it out. Search for Common Ground is another NGO, international NGO with a really strong local presence that tries very hard to reach more marginalized voices. Also has a strong network, and so if you want to get involved through them, that's a great, I would say that they are also incredibly strong and practically oriented, and also focused, again, on reaching those that are hardest to reach, and that would be it. Thank you.
maybe first with the entry points, just to say, yes, we have internships. I think most of our trainees are very happy to work in one of the European Youth Centers because they're really working with the young people, and they take part in the training courses, they take part in the study sessions, and the study sessions are actually the ownership of the youth organizations who decide what subject they want to discuss. They are looking at an emerging issue, and they want to look at solutions to that. So that can be anything. And they can take part in these kind of activities to prepare them, but also to be part of the process itself. So we have it, but unfortunately, we are very poor, so we cannot pay anyone. But we can provide an interesting work, definitely. Either you can choose Strasbourg or Budapest. I hope you come to Budapest. We have a fantastic center there. I would be happy to see you if you would consider that. Other entry points is, I mentioned the Advisory Council on Youth. I think a way of approaching what the Council of Europe is doing, you can have a look on our website, who is a member of the Advisory Council on Youth. And I didn't say it before, 20 members are nominated by the European Youth Forum, which is this European platform for youth organizations, the more traditional ones. So they themselves nominate there. But there are 10 representatives. And actually, maybe some of you will be in the future in the Advisory Council, because 10 representatives, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe nominates. And that are the 10 ones that are not part of this kind of traditional youth organizations. So we really try to make a proposal of a list of people who are working with interesting issues that can complement this traditional, let's say, traditional youth organizations' work, though they are also doing untraditional work also, so I don't want to be unfair to them. I can help you with the website and everything later if you want. To have a look there, contact the Advisory Council. We have the UNOI, the Peace Builders. They are members of the Advisory Council. We have the Refugee Network. They are also members on this mandate of being a different type of movement. You can contact them. I can even tell you who are the members. They're fantastic. So they will, I'm surely they will engage with you. We do a lot of open calls. We do a lot of training courses, capacity building. If I may be a little bit proud, I think we do very, very good training courses in the Council of Europe. We bring a lot of educational materials out, and I think if you can take part in one of our training courses, it's an excellent way of being capacity built. I myself was a youth leader once upon a time in my early 20s, and I benefited from the Council of Europe, and that's the reason why I'm here today, actually, because I took part in one of these training courses. I didn't even know what I was going to. I was like, what is this? And then it turned out to be life-changing for me. So take the opportunity if you can. I would really encourage you. Open calls, not everything is closed. Some things are targeted, but some things are very open. So if you have interesting work that you are doing, we are on Facebook, we have on website, we have a newsletter. You can subscribe to all this, and you can see we put it on. So we're very open with this, and we are always happy to have new groups and new people in our work. I think it's an important, the other question was about how do we work with the young people who are not necessarily in the system. I mentioned these networks, how we work, didn't become these fantastic networks overnight. It took time. And one of the things that we do in the Council of Europe is that we start small. Usually, it is a little capacity building long-term training course that goes over a year and a half, where they are trained, they go home, they do project, they do homework, they come back, they evaluate, they go away again, they try out, they come back, and then there is a core of something that is created among these people. And then this grows into something bigger. And that's how we have established many networks. In the 90s, it was women minorities. We established a network of women minorities. So there are many of these networks. We have established a network of African diaspora. It's up and down with them. They were fantastic in a while, and I think it went down a little bit. And now we hope they are on going up. So there are many of those. So it doesn't happen overnight. We try to also look into the European Youth Foundation that we have. We support projects, and in there we sometimes find very interesting projects, and we try to pull them in our work. So these are different. So there is not one solution. We have many strategies to try to tap into those groups and those movements that are not necessarily represented in our work.
Great, thank you so much. So much detail on the table, and some of the examples of how the institutions are working. I think, making a connection to the first session, Karen, you ended with your takeaway saying there's a need, we listen first, create the space, fill the space. I think what we're hearing now is, I would add, go to the space. That meaningful participation is not simply bringing youth to talk about our agenda, but listening to them as they, and hearing and understanding how they see the agenda. And if you do that, they really will multiply their participation. And I would say just one thing, this point about internships is not a small point. It comes up again and again when we were doing our consultations for the Independent Commission on Multilateralism. Every time we had youth in the room, the point about internships came up. And in the UN also, they're not paid internships. And this question about, if you don't pay interns, then you do get people that have material support at home or such to participate. And what was interesting to me is, in a lot of those consultations, the UN officials, the older men, often kind of like laughed at the question, like, oh, well, you just want a job. But it's actually a really, really fundamentally important issue. But obviously resources are short all around, but maybe it's something that should be invested in, because in understanding that it is not a marginal issue, it's actually a really important issue. Great. We IPI does have paid internships, by the way, but they're very few, and they're not paid very well. So I can't be too proud. We have lunch now. The lunch is a buffet in the next room, and then we'll come back for our session 3 interactive session, where we will be looking to all of you for insights and contributions. So as you're talking and intermingling at lunch, think about something to say and to contribute. Thank you so much, and thank you to all the panelists. It was a really great discussion.